Now, we were supposed to have Auckland Transport next, but I will be moving. We have the Chair of the Climate Change Commission and the Deputy Chair as well here, which is very exciting. So we were going to have, I'll just explain up front before I ask them to come to the table that we, just by chance, had the Chair and Deputy of the Climate Change Commission in Auckland and available for this meeting. So they are not technically presenting to the item 9 paper. They're coming to almost like a public forum. So they're here to discuss the advice, answer our questions for a certain amount of time, and then after that we will have a brief break, and then we'll have the officers come and speak to item 9. So just be clear that this is the staff advice was probably, could have been a workshop, but because we have a climate change committee today, I thought it was important to do this in public, have a discussion in public, and celebrate the fact that they are willing to come speak to us on the advice that came out just over a week, was it 2 weeks ago. So I think that, yeah, it's quite a fantastic opportunity we have. We'll be doing that in public, but I will say we're not debating the advice. It'll be a short presentation from the climate change chair, and then we'll be able to ask questions on the advice. And then we'll move to the item, which is about our submission on that advice. So it will be, I'll be trying to keep that distinction, but just ensuring we're not debating the chair and the deputy chair. They are here to answer our questions. So thank you. So if Rod and Lisa would be able to come up to the table. So we have Dr. Rod Carr and Lisa Tumahai. Oh, sorry. Hang on a second. One moment, sorry.
He te pui no te tonga, tēnei te mihi ki a koe no ngā mana whenua, no ngā whānau o tāmaki makaurau. Te kōrero I roto I tēnei rohe, te whai rawa o te tonga. Aroha mai ki a mātou, engari e mihi ana ki a koe, everyone e kawe mai ana nā kōrero mo te huri haere o te ao, me te riri a ngā tamariki a tāwhiri mātea. No rei roto tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, no te kaunihera, no te koro matua, no te hea mana nei, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Kia ora mai tātou.
Mahana ki a koutou, tēnā koe mana whenua Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, mana whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koe, kia ora koutou. Kia ora. Thank you for the welcome.
Kia ora, and thank you again for both of you for being here. And if Dr. Carr, if you'd like to maybe lead off and introduce yourselves, or each, you might want to individually introduce yourselves, but thank you very much.
Okay. Kia ora everybody. It is a privilege and a pleasure to have this opportunity. As chair of the Hei Pou Arangi Climate Change Commission, New Zealand's independent advisor to the government on climate change matters, I thought I would first introduce myself briefly and then allow Lisa to introduce herself. I was born in Auckland in 1958. I grew up in Auckland. My father worked for the then Auckland Town Planning Authority in the early 1960s, and quite frankly left in despair and went to Western Australia, where he finished his career as Planning Commissioner for Western Australia. Those of you who've been to Perth might have noticed the odd bit of organisation. He had a mind that was somewhat at that extreme of the spectrum when it came to organising things. Sometimes organisation helps a little, and often democracy is messy. So my contribution is not as a climate scientist, and largely I'd have to say that the science around climate is well settled. My contribution is not as a climate policy guru. In fact, 15 months ago, I knew probably less than the average New Zealander about these matters. And I am not a climate activist and have never been one, although I have come to have a great respect for those who have been carrying this burden for some time. The task that the chair of the Climate Change Commission has had has been to bring together independent advice, and I guess that's the role that I have played. I will shortly brief you, and it will be brief, on the process that we have been through in the context of the narrow focus of our role. But let Lisa Tumahai, our very able Deputy Chair, introduce herself.
Kia ora koutou. I'm from a small town, Hokataka, the west coast of the South Island, brought up in Ōtautahi in Christchurch, moved back to the west coast where my bones and my family are, my parents are, in 2016, and have been involved with the iwi for more than 20 years, the iwi of Ngaitahu. I married a Tumahai. Some of you might know the name from up here, from Orake. So it's my husband's family. Auckland is so busy and noisy and crowded when I come from a small town, but I certainly have been watching the challenges that you have, Mr. Mayor, over your time with such a large area, such a diverse community, and with multiple iwi interests that you have a responsibility and obligation to. So I acknowledge the challenge that you have. We as a Commission, we have obligations to meet within our legislation that reflect the treaty, and so we have a work program that is to ensure that we engage appropriately with iwi Māori, and that their voice is heard and informs our thinking and our advice to the Minister. So, kia ora.
Thank you, Lisa. So the first thing I would say is that the Commission is not all things environmental, and it's not even all things climate. Our role is to provide advice to the government of the day. We have no decision rights, and that advice should be independent and evidence-based, and that advice is only about a certain narrow range of things. First of all, to advise the government whether New Zealand is on track to achieve the statutory targets for emissions reduction that have already been agreed by Parliament. And as a quick reminder, those targets are to reduce biogenic methane by 10% from its 2017 level by 2030, and by between 24 and 47% from the 2017 level by 2050. And by 2050, to be net zero for all other long-lived gases. So the statutory targets have been set. They are not up for renegotiation. So the task for the Commission is to say, is New Zealand on track to achieve those targets? And if not, what is the direction of policy advice the Commission would offer our government at the time to either put us on track or keep us on track? That was the task that we were set under the Act. And then to advise the government what plan needs to be put in place in the first emissions period, that is the period till 2025, to set us up for success. The Minister, thinking that wasn't a big enough task, gave us two other tasks to do concurrently. One was to say, well, in the longer term, towards the end of this century, what biogenic methane reduction would be required for us to be on a 1.5% increase in global temperatures consistent with our obligations under the Paris Agreement. And, while you're at that, tell us whether our nationally determined contribution, i.e. that share of global emissions that we've signed up for, is compatible with a 1.5 degree outcome and New Zealand's obligations under the Paris Agreement. The work of the Commission was first to establish where we think we are and where we think we're going under current policy settings, and whether that would get us to where we need to be. No surprise, the conclusion is no, we're not on that track. We will fall short of achieving those statutory targets without further action. The further action I'm not going to try and summarise, but the further action is essentially the draft advice which is now out for public consultation. And the action comes in many parts. Some of it is quite high level, that central and local government need to be required and enabled to collaborate for outcomes consistent with the emissions budgets. That we need to engage in partnership with iwi Māori if we are to achieve these targets. And that the government needs to consider whether there is a place in the process around evaluating policy actions for a wider forum of New Zealanders than currently exists through our work as an independent commission required to consult and the work of Parliament as the duly elected representatives of all of us. So we've got some pretty high-level, try harder, do better recommendations, but then we also have some very specific recommendations, particularly around transport. But let me just back up the bus a little and tell you about the process and where we're at. So the Commission was formed a little over a year ago and stood on the shoulders of the interim Climate Change Committee. We inherited their body of work and many of their staff. But in the last year, we have been in the process of building models, consulting with peer groups and peak bodies to establish the evidence base which is in our draft report. That process is never perfect and never complete. The opportunity now, and here's our Chief Executive, Joe Hendy, who thought we were starting at 11, but welcome, Joe, good to have you with us. But the opportunity now in the public consultation process is to seek your input as directly impacted and affected parties on the advice that we are in the process of forming. In that process, we've to date already, in the formation of the draft advice, had over 700 engagements with individuals, small groups, large organisations, public forums and webinars. But there is more to come. The opportunity is for you to look at, through the eyes of those that you empower, the advice that we are drafting, and particularly where it impacts on the roles and responsibilities that you have, to make sure that we understand the barriers and enablers to the transition that New Zealand must make to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We highlight transport because 40% of all our long life gas emissions come from transport. We highlight agriculture because agriculture has specific defined targets for emissions reductions that need to be achieved. And we highlight energy production, not because the emissions from current production of energy are large contributors, but because we need to build out dramatically and quite rapidly our source of renewable energy, whether it's for the purpose of creating electricity or biofuels. For Auckland, transport matters a lot. How we get around and how we move stuff around is important. And the Commission makes some assumptions at a national level about how we might change our modes of transport. We assume, for example, increases in walked and biked journeys and journeys on public transport that displace current kilometres travelled in internal combustion engine cars. We have advice that will make the cost of old fossil fuels technology higher and less readily available, while at the same time putting a price and potentially providing support for lower emissions alternatives. I don't want to rehearse all of our advice today. I do want to say that Auckland matters a lot, that New Zealand cannot achieve its targets without Auckland being able to play its part. And so we do need to understand the enablers and barriers to getting emissions reductions in this substantial community. And one final thing that often comes up is, so are we picking on industries or technologies? No, we are not. We are picking on low and no emissions technologies. We are not picking out winners and losers. The loser here will be all of New Zealand if by 2050 We haven't embraced the technologies that will be prevalent in the second half of the 21st century. And those will be low emissions technologies, the infrastructure, skills and capabilities necessary to take advantage of them. But when we get there, we will have a greener, cleaner, healthier, less vulnerable and more sustainable society. This is not all about doing this to wear a hair shirt for the benefit of others. We will be the biggest beneficiaries of decarbonising our way of life. I'm delighted to take the opportunity to field your questions. Kia ora.
That was a perfect summation. I just wondered if, Lisa, if you had anything to add, or Joe, if you'd like to introduce yourself, because sorry, early, usually these committees don't run to time, so thank you for being here bang on time.
So
If you want to press the talk button in front, yes.
yes, hi, I'm Chief Executive at the Climate Commission, so I lead the day-to-day work of the team there that have all contributed to what Rod has just introduced. I'll hand over to Lisa.
Actually, I'm going to make Jo do something that she does really well. Unlike me, who has no history in climate action or climate policy, I want Jo to just introduce herself a little bit more. Tell us your story.
My story. So I have been working in climate change issues pretty much my entire career. I always like starting a story back in the 1800s, and I wasn't alive then, but my great-great-grandmother was alive then, and that is when scientists first worked out that putting burning greenhouse gases, putting carbon dioxide into the air, was going to result in rising temperatures. And 100 years, or more than 100 years on from that, is when the world, in the 1990s, agreed to tackle climate change when I was a teenager. And that is when I got hooked on thinking about climate change issues. Rolling on from that, we're 30 years on. I have been working, I had a career at Motu Economic Research and the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment, involved in various environmental investigations and a number related to climate change. So now it brings us 30 years on, since we agreed as a country, as a world, to tackle climate change. And our gross emissions have not gone down, and we have not managed to do that. In fact, our gross emissions have risen. So an exciting time today, this year, giving us a chance to put in place our first cohesive strategic plan to bring emissions down and achieve our targets.
Thank you, Jo. And Lisa, could you explain a little of the process by which we've engaged with iwi Māori?
Yeah, so because of just some of the restrictions with COVID and our ability to get out really widely across the country, which is really important that iwi are engaged in a valued way, where it's not consultation, it's valued engagement. We've taken a case study approach, and we've worked with about 5 marae and 7 land trusts, so Māori land trusts who have agriculture, forestry, thermal interests, and we've done case studies to understand what climate change means for them. What do they see as certain impacts on their world going forward? So that information has been extremely valuable, and in reading them, it could be my marae back home. So I think what we've gathered is something that can be generic, but it's also unique to those particular places. So it's valuable information to inform our thinking and the advice that's going forward. But we do have a strong commitment and obligation to iwi Māori through our engagement process.
Cool. Thank you very much. So Councillor Newman, first question.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Dr. Carr and members of your team. I think that what you've said is pertinent, and having a look at your website and having read through some of the chapters of your advice has been really compelling. Chapter 4B addresses transport and urban form and building. You make the point in your chapter, quote, urban planning that decreases the need for carbon-intensive transportation in the long term, such as compact pedestrianised cities and towns, plays an important role in limiting future emissions. I absolutely agree with that, and that is fundamental to the regional policy statement of Auckland Council. We're trying to give effect to that through our planning framework. What I'm really struggling with at the moment is not our unitary plan, it's a direction of central government policy settings around urban planning, which appear to be going in the opposite direction, doing away with the rural-urban boundary, liberalising greenfields development and urban sprawl, which to me just seems to be the antithesis of a focus on reducing carbon emissions in terms of planning. So what I want to know, I'd like your help. What do I need to do? Should this council continue to try and give effect to the policy directions of the Auckland Unitary Plan, which gives effect to what you're trying to achieve? Or should we give way to what government is wanting to achieve by liberalising greenfields development, allowing all that sprawl, understanding that low density will increase emissions?
Welcome to the world of complexity, which is not new news, I know. Look, part of it is stand up for what you believe in, so don't roll over, would be to point out the alternatives and make sure that it's not just about we can't do this. As I'm sure you know, you need to also say, and this is what you can do, and it will be better, and it can happen sooner, because the issue of housing that is confronting the government is how do we create more affordable housing. They seem to have convinced or been convinced that converting rural land to sprawl is a solution to that problem. If the conclusion is that is not the solution, then you really do need to do what I know you want to do, which is actively enable the increased density of housing, particularly along public transport routes. And that's going to require you to stare down some of the communities who would rather it was left just how it is. And that's the tension in a democracy, is that everybody gets a say, but in the end, someone has to decide.
I have a follow-up, Chair, just one more. I accept the premise of increasing heights and increasing density along rail corridors and hubs and within our metro centres. That's provided for in the unitary plan. But still, there is an override which is taking place here, which I think is driven by developers, where some within government have got on board with it, and that is to provide for sprawl anyway. And I'm worried about that, because to me, we can try and encourage development in one location, but if developers and the government and the market want to go somewhere else, I'm not quite sure how I can stop that.
You people are the politicians. You can deal with central government. When it comes to markets, I believe in the efficiency of markets, but I also believe that markets fail. Markets fail in three particular areas, and I've been a student, academic and practitioner of these things for 40 years. The first thing they fail at is time. Markets discount the future too heavily. Secondly, they fail because markets are indifferent to the distributional outcomes of the pricing of resources. And markets also fail because new technologies that evolve are subject to regulation, as are old technologies. So one has to always accept the limits of markets, and the hubris of markets choose is to ignore the fact that markets are allowed to do what we allow them to do. And so if you can hold central government to account for its emissions budgets, which are statutory obligations once committed to, and you can point out how the practices that they are promoting breach those budgets, you will create the opportunity for a dialogue that does not exist today, but will exist by Christmas. Because remember, under the Act, a government is required to lock in emissions budgets and an emissions reduction plan by the 31st of December this year. It doesn't have to be our plan, but if it's not taking our advice, it has to explain why not and put the alternative plan into law.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. I'll try and keep it sort of as brief as I can. Firstly, a sort of more of a left field question. Do you foresee climate refugees as part of this country's future?
I'm going to let both my colleagues answer so that they get some airtime too, but let's start with Lisa.
Oh, God, do I really want to? Look, whether it's climate change or pandemics, highly likely too.
Do you think then that your advice, as aggressive as it is, may not be aggressive enough to deal with a huge influx of resident population in a short amount of time?
Here's a quick answer on that. There are two types of refugees, and we're discovering that. One is the passport holders who have a right to return, and there's 1 million of them out there, and they're called New Zealand citizens abroad. We have no willingness, ability or appetite, except under extreme circumstance, to control the right to return. So some of these climate refugees may well be our own people coming home. Secondly, other than that, it is what we choose to allow, because we do have the tyranny of a rather large blue ocean between us. That doesn't mean you won't get a hijacked cruise liner turning up in Auckland at some point. But we need to be open to supporting our Pacific neighbours who are most adversely impacted and least able to respond, and be generous and open-handed in how we create opportunities for them. I'm not certain public policy yet is developing an appropriate way of responding to that challenge. There'll be a different set of climate refugees as well, and they'll be the internal New Zealanders who are displaced as a result of adaptation to climate effects that are already underway. And how are we going to deal with local communities where we must make some tough choices about what we protect and when we retreat? So the refugees are not all coming to us without a passport, and some of them are already in country.
Thank you. Just one more, if that's okay, just a little one. Thank you, Chair. Thanks. So these targets involve steep emissions cuts. How will you consider smoothing the effects of steep cuts on low-income and geographically disconnected communities?
So one of the things we emphasise in our advice is that although this transition, we can do it, it's manageable at an aggregate level. Those costs are well affordable. The costs won't fall evenly on New Zealanders, and there will be particular groups who will be hit harder than others, and those that will be least able to adjust. So within the advice, you'll see some recommendations around the fact that we need to anticipate that and manage that from the outset.
But I also think one thing to remember is these people should be supported to change, not supported to continue doing what they're doing. And there's the challenge, is the nature of the support is to transition to a lower emissions future. It's not to pay so you can afford to keep doing the high emitting activity.
Thank you. Councillor Walker.
Sure. Got a couple of related questions, and they're partly informed by my participation at the Rio and the Paris climate talks. And certainly one of the observations, and I just wonder how far your commission can go to promoting it, is the importance of cities taking an active role around the Conference of Parties table in actively promoting climate change targets, given that often there is a problem with countries, but it is cities that are actively leading the charge in reducing emissions across the globe. And the necessity for councils like ours, other cities in New Zealand, to be active politically, because the solution is think global, act local, but we have to have that global political mechanism. What's your comment on that?
So I think that's an important insight, is the way this thing's going to get done is not by rural New Zealand picking a fight with urban New Zealand. The lessons we can learn, for example, if you're a city of Auckland's size and nature, are most likely to be learnt by hunkering down with cities with a comparable size and nature, and there may be only 10 or 15 of that universe in the world, but you will probably learn more useful stuff by being in the room with them about plans, strategies and tactics to get stuff done. In the same way for agriculture, you know, our sheep and beef farmers are probably going to be able to learn more by learning what is going on in Ireland than they are by understanding what's happening in the suburbs of Auckland. So I think that multilateral, inter-sector, find people who look like they're confronting the same issues you are and engage with them is really important, because every community is different. Every emission matters. No reduction is too little or too soon. And so learning from others is a really key part about how we're going to deal with this. But Lisa, you can, how do we leverage communities?
Yeah, I think, you know, pandemic, you know, we've had to come together, cross-agency, working together to ensure that we protect and work with our communities in a particular way, and climate change is no different. We're going to have to look outside of ourselves to partner with others, but also, you know, really passionate about our rural communities developing their tailored solutions, which are not going to be the same as what you need here in Auckland. But councils have committees like yourself who have obligations and responsibilities to be champions of climate change, responses to climate change, and how you're going to move yourselves to a different way of being. So we rely on champions across our communities.
The other related question I've got goes to the role of local government, not just cities but district councils. And would it be fair to say on the part of the Commission that if you can empower and enable territorial authorities so they've got action plans, so they're implementing, so that they're monitoring and managing, producing the sums, you aggregate that up and you've got your strategy. So we have a direct responsibility, and if you can engage with us and empower us and other cities, then together we can make the difference.
Which is why you'll see part of our recommendation is it is important that central and local government get their act together, figure out what the barriers to achieving these targets and budgets are, and councils are enabled to play their part. Couldn't agree more. I think the other part of yes, it is the aggregation of all of our household community activities. Councils themselves are increasingly aware of the footprint from their own activities, but relatively the activities of the council that affect emissions are not whether you have a fleet of electric buses, they're whether you support urban sprawl. So part of the reach of governing bodies is well beyond their own footprint, but role modelling good behaviour is actually really important. So we recommend that the task force for climate-related risk disclosures, that TCFD stuff, be extended to central and local government for exactly the reason that you've said, that the transparency and what gets measured gets managed. The ability of the public to hold central and local government to account for the carbon footprints of their actions and decisions, I think is important. And we also recommend that the government consider that lending institutions are required to disclose the enabling activities' carbon footprint from their lending behaviours for a similar reason.
Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa. Really just welcome. This is a big moment for us today, but it's a big moment for the country. And I just want to acknowledge, Rod, the way you're leading this. I sort of felt like it was like easy listening music, but with meaningful lyrics. I'm really listening, so thank you. I appreciate it. Look, I just wanted, I don't pretend to have digested all 189 pages at this time, but I have read through with interest, particularly in the transport area. I noticed a comment early up in the document. You say we must decide where our ambition lies. Really quite pointed, actually. And then you go on to say transformational lasting change is needed. And then under transport, you outlined the move to EVs by 2035. I think That's been well documented in media. But then there's subset to that, and it's equally as important. Targets to increase low emissions public and shared transport, walking and cycling emphasised, supporting public transport uptake. We're talking cities here now. We're really starting to talk about us. And we're also talking about councils introducing first and last kilometre travel solutions, that shared and again active, walking and cycling. So you note that. In March this year, I'm less than a month away, Auckland Council and Auckland Transport will be putting out for public consultation a really important document which feeds into all of this, and that's the Regional Land Transport Plan for the next 10 years. And my question to you is, what would your advice be to this council, opening up on that first statement or reflecting on that first statement of deciding where our ambition lies? What would your message be to this council about that Regional Land Transport Plan? Do we wait for this document to be finalised, or do we reflect on it now and start to think and make our changes right now?
Well, that's a bit of a patsy question, because of course you should act now. What is interesting is we're watching central and local government begin to act. We've seen the business community begin to progress. Smart people are not waiting for the finalisation of some sort of piece of advice. The climate is not waiting for our advice. That I think you should take as read that some of these things are simply writing up the blindingly obvious. It doesn't require a prettier document to be tabled in Parliament to prove the case. The spectrum of ambition that I've occasionally painted in respect of our nationally determined contribution may be relevant. At one point on that spectrum is, should we do as little as we think we can get away with, or should we do as much as we believe our grandchildren will want us to do?
Thank you. And I'm trying to write that down. Member Wilson.
Kia ora koutou. I'm going to really ensure that I keep this pretty simple and is to do more with the process. Thank you, Lisa. You talked about the engagement with iwi Māori, and you outlined some of the examples that had been undertaken. I understood there to be 700 plus in the nature of engagement overall. I wasn't sure, that's my first question, and I've got one more. I wasn't sure whether you meant what you were doing currently, including the rural part of Māori, that was a finite amount of engagement. And I'd also like to know whether the expectation is the Commission will do their part of the iwi Māori, you described it as, which I like, value engagement, or whether there's the expectation that will be complemented by each of the individual council doing the same. So I was just trying to see whether that was a one-off on behalf of the Commission, or there's an expectation that would be handed to council.
Kia ora. No, so we have an engagement plan in place which requires further engagement with iwi Māori. So we're engaging through the Pou Taki Ahuarangi, which is the National Iwi Chairs Forum Climate Change Pou. That's one body of engagement, but we recognise that there are iwi who are not members of that. So we're reaching out through networks and through others. We're inviting iwi to connect with us, whether that may be by Zoom, whether that may be being able to cobble iwi into a cluster within a territory, just recognising the COVID environment that we're in and time. So engagement is ongoing. We welcome it, and we'll continue to try and do the best that we can to reach out right across. Also, there's a Māori Climate Network that's in its infancy, that's building. The members of that are wider than iwi, so it's out to urban Māori, Māori Council, FOMA and others are part of that building membership of a network of Māori. Because what we do recognise is that this is wider than what iwi can also achieve. It's out into communities, it's out into hapu, into marae. So we'll do the very best we can. You yourself know the difficulties, what you probably have when you've got multiple iwi to engage with. So it is difficult, but we've certainly got a drive to do that and ensure we do it well. In terms of your own engagement with your communities, I'll leave that with you. Yeah.
So just
One other point I would make,
Sorry.
though, is we don't have an end date. The commission is I called it perpetual once, and somebody reassured me nothing was perpetual. But we are a commission without an end date, so we need to build enduring relationships across New Zealand with iwi Māori, and we understand that, you know, yes, we've issued a draft report now, but this is one of many processes that we are engaged with. And we need to find the pace and the pattern of engagement with iwi Māori that is valued and valuable both to them and to us, and that will take time. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, all done, go home, write the next report. This is a process that we need to establish. Kia ora.
Thank you. And I guess the kōrero that we have here, you're probably well aware, so that's been helpful, is emphasising precisely those things on simple matters or more complex. So it was in an effort to aid, because it is very complex up here in terms of the iwi dynamics, as you're probably well aware, Lisa. So I was just trying to see how structured it could be, so ourselves as the board would be able to gauge or assist in some way, shape or form to make sure that there are bodies there, that they would all feel that they have been engaged, because no doubt Auckland Council always gets that. We didn't get an opportunity. So I guess that's an invitation to feel free to avail yourselves of any of the support that the IMSB can offer to enable that.
Thank you. And I welcome that direct connection back through to the Commission as well, if iwi want to, or hapu want to just contact us as well. We can do Zooms as good as any, but kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation and being here today. I wanted to ask, my first initial response was, I don't see New Zealand as the losers. I see Tuvalu and Kiribati as the losers if we don't get this right as a country and a city. But my concern is about further perpetuating the inequities that exist in our communities with this, because as you point out quite a lot in your reports, not everyone's going to be able to switch over to an electric vehicle. Not everyone has access to public transport. So I wanted to know, does your advice go further into what you put as proactive and targeted support to ensure that lower income and rural households, can access the benefits of EVs, but even further than that, not just about the EVs, but the behaviour change? Is there anything overseas that might help with your advice to government about that behaviour change in minority communities? How do we all go forward together without people being left behind, which sounds like a political slogan?
So there's the environmental impacts, then there is those socio-economic impacts, there's those health determinants. How do we ensure what we're doing is not going to ensure that that's just increasing? So we're well aware of that, and that is within our advice, and I'm quite sure I'm going to hear from those in the primary health sector that maybe our advice isn't strong enough to ensure from a public health perspective we're identifying the impacts that this is going to further have on community. So our advice, if it's not strong enough, we welcome feedback on that. We're very mindful of it, and then it's hopefully adopted by the government, and it's their job to give effect to it. So, but really welcome the feedback.
I'll just draw attention to also one particular recommendation we have about local transition planning, enabled by central government, involving councils, involving the communities, so that it's not just a top-down imposed transition, but actually has taking into account the local circumstances of people, and really getting that broader buy-in from the community for the transition. And one of the balances that we have been, or questions we've been asking ourselves as we do this, produce this draft advice, was, is it ambitious enough? Is it fair and equitable? Can we manage it? Can policy deliver it? All of these things need to go into the mix in terms of those transition plans. And the pace is a really key part of that. If we go too slow, we will not achieve our emissions goals. We won't get there. But too hastily, and we will create an awful lot of disruption for people who cannot afford to change at such a fast rate.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting observation, is the pace of transition determines where there are windfall gains and where there are unavoidable burdens. The faster we try and do this, the more likely it is that those who happen to be in the right place with resources win unexpectedly, and the more likely it is that those unable to change are essentially just bearing a burden that feels like a tax. So the calibration of pace isn't just about go hard, go fast. It is go as fast as you can and as hard as you can, but what matters is to sustain the momentum. That's what's going to get us there. It's not a quick action that is rolled over 3 years later. It is engaging and putting ourselves on a pathway that we can stick to. So impacted communities is important. There is no doubt that jobs in the fossil fuel sector, in the extraction and distribution of coal for combustion locally, in the extraction and distribution of gas through pipelines, and in the fracking of oil into its component parts, those kind of jobs are not all disappearing at Christmas, but there will be reducing employment opportunities and careers in those industries in New Zealand. But there will be brand new jobs created in the bioeconomy, in the development of renewables infrastructure, and in the addition of more efficient devices at the end of those wires, whether they're EVs, e-bikes, heat pumps, solar panels, and on the list will go. So part of this is about signalling a direction of travel that is locked in, that gives business and communities some certainty about what's going to happen next. And that is best achieved if we can depoliticise the pathway by getting the buy-in at central, local, government level and for our communities that this is something we can do, it's something we should do, and it's something we will do. And then you are right, we need to understand where are the burdens falling on those least able to change and help them through the change. So our advice is on the direction of policy. It doesn't say, write this check to these people, but in the end, that's the nature of the policy that will need to be written.
Thank you. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Rod and Lisa and Joe, for your presentations. And Rod, I won't get lyrical like Councillor Darby did, but the precision of your presentation was really helpful. The fact that in your report you said that this can be done in this is achievable and affordable, I think gives us hope, because sometimes it looks a bit dismal. And I think you're right about two things. You've just made a comment on the pace of transition, not too slow because we can't afford it, but go too fast and you'll find that it's not sustainable, and depoliticise the pathway. I think that's incredibly good advice, and thank you for that. My question is really to get you to focus in on how you think we should prioritise our actions. You talked about barriers and enablers, and I'm sure you're aware that the barrier for local government is that local government collectively, every local government in this country collectively raises and spends 7% of public revenue. So therefore the resourcing is at a central level, but also the power is at a central level for a great many things. And you talk about the need to incentivise electric cars. Couldn't agree more, but that's not within our ability, yet we're still seeing 20 electric petrol-driven or diesel-driven SUVs to every one electric car. So in terms of the enablers, you know, we are looking at a compact quality urban form, and I think it's a little unfair to say that we're about sprawl. 2/3 of all of our consents now are multi-unit dwellings, intensified. It was about 5% 4 or 5 years ago, and that comes back to the pace of transition. When you look around our city, where you were born, you'll just see total transformation, you know, where terrace housing never existed, multi-unit apartments, 39 stories downtown. And the problem is carrying people with you, because the pace of that already is causing, you know, a pushback on us. So we moved a unitary plan that enabled that to happen. And the other thing is about mode change, which we're trying to do as well, but we're right at the edge of our budget on what we can do with things like CRL and the busways and all the other. So given those barriers that we face, and given the fact that we are committing to having zero waste by 2040, we're committed to mode change, we're committed to densification, where is it that we can, within the limits of our budget, be doing a whole lot more, in your opinion?
So helping the community to understand, it's not all about the spending of the money. Some of it is about the coaching and guiding that leaders play in their community. So I'm preaching to the converted, I know. Some of it is about challenging central government, not with their budget, your budget, but challenging their thought processes and decision making. Some of it is about finding the clever things that have been done by other cities that look and feel like they're confronting the same issues as you are, and then importing and adapting and adopting those ideas for New Zealand. We're quite good at that. We search the world, we find stuff, we modify it for our context, and then we get on with it. So I'm not going to profess to have all of the answers, but essentially it is important you keep saying what you're saying. Tell us about the successes as well, because sometimes all we hear is about we can't, we won't, we shouldn't. So reminding us and the community of what has been done, is being done, and how that will change, and not saying how hard it is, but relatively looking back, how proud you are of what's been achieved. I think all of that goes to building that sustainable momentum. The more we allow the narrative of it's too expensive, it's too hard, others are not doing enough, leave us alone, get to us later, the more we let that narrative prevail, then the worse off our children will be. So, yeah, be proud of what you've done, acknowledge the challenge that's ahead, and then lead into it. And you can't do a lot more than that.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for organising this really stimulating. Sometimes council can be a little bit tedious, but this is really great today. You've talked about empowering and enabling, and the Mayor's just spoken, but the way that I see it is we're on a treadmill of obligations as a creature of statute in local government. We acknowledge that we've got, as New Zealand's largest city, we've got particular responsibilities. But I guess my question is, what trumps what? I mean, we have all these statutory obligations. Right at the moment, we're having workshop after workshop after workshop with our obligations under an LTP. And what I'm interested in are those strategies that we can actually deploy that will not have us bypass our statutory obligations, but where, you know, what trumps what as we try and understand our role. That's really my question, because so often council is well-intentioned but ineffective. And I think that we've actually got to bypass a lot of what is going on. And I have a second question. I'm not sure who I should address it to, but I believe that Auckland has a very big obligation to try and depoliticise a lot of these issues. So from my own experience from Parliament, it's better not to go and brief this caucus and that caucus, but to bring the Auckland MPs together and to talk to them irrespective of what their party allegiances are. And I would really appreciate your advice on that, and whether we should be working more closely with the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment to actually navigate the statutory changes that are going to be necessary in order for us to get off that treadmill of obligations. So, a couple of questions in there.
I'll do trumping, and I'll let these guys do the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. Of course, you should talk to Simon. Look, what trumps what? Yeah. Always in a democracy, you have conflicting legitimate claims that compete. The challenge for all of us is that increasingly this climate stuff, we just have to take a responsibility for. And you can use the slightly passionate terminology of the voice of the unborn child. You can describe it as the decade in which we have the last opportunity to make a real difference. You can make the argument that what matters this week matters more than what happens next year. But the science on this stuff is so clear, and the emerging geopolitics of it is going to be so compelling that if you want to know, it won't be a surprise coming from the chair of the Climate Commission, what should dominate your paradigm of thinking, it should be, if we make this decision, are we locking in a capital investment and a pathway that we will regret? Or are we enabling choices for our future that if things go the wrong way, we will have the least regrets about having done? In my insurance background, you come across a few paradigms of thinking, and one is about the probability of ruin. What are the chances that this decision or series of decision is irreversible and devastating? The probability of regret. Payoffs are asymmetrical in that sometimes you get a lot for a little, and sometimes you get a little for a lot. So think about your decisions every time you make them of, what if I'm wrong, what if I'm right? And in climate change, what if it doesn't turn out as bad as we think it is? And we've done all this stuff to live in a healthier, cleaner, greeny, more less vulnerable, more sustainable world. What happens if we didn't need to do all that we did? But what happens if we didn't do what we should have done? And I think that idea of framing things, it's not just a 50-50 toss of the coin. And then finally, I would say that helping people understand is a prerequisite to getting them to engage. And it is interesting when we let the narrative run away with things that are simply not facts, that we set ourselves back. There is nothing in the work of the Commission that says you cannot use your backyard barbecue. There is nothing that says we're going to rip out the pipes that currently support the technology in restaurants for cooking your steak. There is nothing in our advice that says you can't burn coal on your open hearth in those cities that allow you to do it. Right? So let's be careful that the narrative isn't stolen by a group who have a different interest at heart.
And just in response to your question about working with the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, I would say that would be best put to the Commissioner. But I would add that working cross-party, working with the different caucuses is a very effective thing to do. I know that there has been the Globe movement, which is MPs across party, around the world, and New Zealand has a chapter, and they had been working for a number of years before the zero carbon bill was put to Parliament, and it was a very constructive and effective way to work towards depoliticising the issues.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. And today was a tag team with myself and Alec Tang as well. But thank you for saying it's worthwhile. So thank you. Deputy Chair, Councillor Coombe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou. Really delighted that you've been able to come along today. The synchronicity is just fantastic. And as you've heard from other councillors, it's just a really engaging session. So thank you. And I think my question has been partly answered by Dr. Carr, because I was going to invite you whether you wanted to do any myth busting, because I know when the draft advice was released, there were a few sectors who were doing a little bit of mischief making and a bit of a beat up, but you probably did quite a good little summary there in response to Councillor Fletcher's question. But was there anything else that you'd like to add in terms of if anyone's got any concerns around the room about having their barbecue confiscated?
I'll do two more. There is an allocation of coal for New Zealand Steel sitting in our budgets out to 2050. So, you know, what we're seeing is a reduction in coal mined and consumed in New Zealand, and we say nothing about coal exports, but petajoules from coal being used in New Zealand declines by 70% by 2035 and 75% by 2050. We do make a recognition that there are hard to abate emissions, and steel making in New Zealand is one of them. We don't assume a new technology. So we are actually meeting with BlueScope after we've had this conversation, which is interesting. The myth busting is that we've kind of got the gun out and we're going out to kill 15% of the flocks and herds in New Zealand. That is actually not true. There is no targeted number of livestock in our advice. What we do say is that if you look at the land use changes that are happening and that would be implied by our carbon budgets and emissions reduction plan, and you consider the wider adoption of the better practices by farmers across New Zealand, then you will get a 13% reduction in biogenic methane by 2030, and you'll be able to maintain meat and milk production volumes at current levels, and consistent with that, you'll see 15% less animals. It's not a target for a reduction of headcount, it is a target to reduce biogenic methane emissions.
Thanks for that. And if I could just add, you've really given us a lot of food for thought in terms of what will go into our submission. But one thing that I really grabbed onto was an earlier comment about the need for us to understand the enablers and the barriers. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably, if that's a fair summary of just one of the key things that we should focus on, because we do have our climate plan, we have our targets which were actually are more aggressive. We have lots of strategies and ways to get there, but perhaps that's something that we really need to particularly focus on.
Yep.
So thank you.
Councillor Philippine.
Kia ora koutou katoa, moa koutou mahi. So thank you for the work that you've done. I want to ask some questions, and there won't be that many, but it's on your annual report, 9 December 19 to 30th June 2020, because there are some aspects in there that I just wanted to question. But my first question is to you, Dr. Carr. Did you say earlier that the Commission itself is at the moment on a never-ending cycle? Can you just confirm that there is no end date to the Commission?
Correct. There is no end date to the Commission, although we can be snuffed out by parliamentary action at any time.
No, I agree. It's just like ties. Yeah. Yeah. It's just like ties. They can be snuffed out as well. So look, also your vision, the outcomes framework that is in that annual report, and the strategic objectives. Now, it's interesting, and I was just having a look at the strategic objectives of building infrastructure, connecting and performing. And there's a mention here of te mahere whakamua. And that's the Māori Pacific work stream. I'll be interested in the intervening time from June 2020 to now, how that work stream is going. And this is in light of Member Wilson's question earlier around the engagement with Māori. So that's, and I've got about 2 more questions in, but they're very, very quick.
Okay.
Do you know the Pacific engagement? Oh, kia ora. Thank you for raising that. The way that we're hoping to reach out into communities, so firstly we've probably likely prioritised to ensure iwi have their voice heard in terms of the treaty obligations we have within our legislation. One of the pieces of work that the team are looking at is how do we reach out to other communities, and I mentioned the Climate Network. That is not just a Māori focus. I understand the network also has a focus on Pacific and other nations who are impacted by New Zealand's climate change approach, but also those within our communities existing already who may not be having a voice in this climate change space. So it's a work in progress, and actually I'll raise that back with our team internally so that we can come back to you and let you know what is in our planning over the next 6 months to ensure that the Pacific voice has come through in our work. Kia ora.
Ka pai. So, no, kia ora for that. Another question is on page 12 of your annual plan, and you've got a heading here, we have taken opportunities to proactively provide advice to the Minister and the government, including. Now, in there, you mentioned 6 principles, which I love, with the 6 principles, but the paragraph that followed the 6 principles was, these principles have been well received and have been picked up by the ministers and others and used to help shape thinking about recovery investments. Have they picked it up, or have they just said to you, oh man, we love the words and done nothing? That's why when I see something like that, look, oh, they've, well received. It's basically saying, oh, nah, look, thanks very much, but nah, it's all good. So I just wanted to sort of see whether in the intervening time again, that they have been received and enacted on, please.
I'm going to answer a piece of that. I love the question, by the way, and I'll let Joe say something. So the first thing is that they were well received, and were they as influential as we would like? No. So if we look at the $2.5 billion worth of shovel-ready project funding that was approved, and it was largely in that sense that we wrote the letter to the decision-making ministers at the time and said, as you roll out these shovel-ready projects to stimulate economic activity as a response of the slowdown from COVID, please look at them using these principles. And if we look at that $2.5 billion of shovel-ready projects, I think there were like 150 projects funded. About 500 million we could sort of tick a climate action box for, so 20%, pushing for more. And if we looked at that, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but about half of it related to enabling infrastructure for mobility, right? There's quite a chunk. The challenge is you could say tick the box, it was all about bikes. The trouble is a lot of it was recreational cycleways rather than, and you've got to be careful here, recreational cycleways are a gateway to getting behaviour change, but actually you need the enabling infrastructure to get to school and to get to work from home. Those are the journeys which will displace emissions. I love the rail trail. I've done it 5 times, but it didn't replace a single piece of emitted carbon for me. So I think, can we do more? Yes. Can we do better? Yes. Should we do it more often? Yes. Should every decision that is made by central and local government and the private sector be looked at through those 6 principles? In my view, yes.
I'll just add to that the Commission has a monitoring role. So we're producing advice this year, and then we will be coming back to monitor progress towards the budgets and the emissions reduction plans year on year on year. So looking at those principles, seeing if they are being applied, and then calling out progress or lack of will be something that we will be moving into in the coming year.
Just one comment then, Chair, and that's it. Look, thank you again. Obviously, I haven't gone through the whole of the draft, but I'll leave that to the staff to do. And then for the recommendation up there that the Chair, the Deputy Chair and Independent Māori Statutory Board Member end up approving for us. So thank you. Ngā mihi kia koutou.
Yeah. Can I do one more myth busting before we leave?
There are still 2 more questions. I'm happy for the myth busting to come now.
One of the myths is we contribute so little it doesn't matter. Right? I'm sure that you've confronted that in your own conversations and conversations around the barbecue. Let me answer it the way I would like us to think about this. New Zealand has 0.06 of 1% of the world's population. We are little. We emit 0.17% of all global emissions. That's 3 times our share of the population. Historically, we have been attributed 0.3 of 1% of all the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere having been emitted since the Industrial Revolution. That is 5 times our population. If we took all of our agricultural emissions out of our emissions profile and left all of China's manufacturing in their profile, our emissions would still be twice theirs per capita. We are among the richest nations in the world, and we have access to technologies that, should we choose to, we can reduce our emissions. This is indeed a choice we are making. We can afford it, and arguing that because we're little, we won't make a difference would have meant that every New Zealander who ever fought in any war wasted their effort, because clearly we were never going to make that much difference. We need to do the right thing and role model for 100 small countries that look like us, that being little does not get you out of jail free. But being little and taking action reassures others that they too can take meaningful action. And those 100 little countries are 1/3 of global emissions.
Very good point. Councillor Cooper.
Yeah, kia ora koutou to all of you. I represent West Auckland, so I'm very happy to see in your urban form chapter that we should be prioritising areas of South Auckland and West Auckland for transport where it's been underinvested in. So that's good. But, you know, as we see, I guess my question is around, one is, when you talk about, for example, that example of the gas, and everybody goes crazy about, you know, I want to cook with gas and I want my barbecue. You can give very sensible advice. But sometimes governments will go the full hog, which, you know, that's, they want to do the right thing, but often you have these funny little unintended consequences. What's your advice to government around that sort of approach, that let's mop up the biggest amount of things we can that'll make the biggest difference, when you're looking at laws, you know, that then often kind of then put people offside, making laws that are really going to bring everybody on board, you know, that don't niggle those little things, that creates a big, huge conversation that then talks about let's not do anything. I guess that's the sort of question, because it's the same thing around, you know, and often that, you know, when you're talking about one thing, nothing is in isolation, is it? You know, we build way out at the end of, you know, the region. So if you look at our NPS on urban development, you know, it's a lot of it is about using sprawl and greenfields. So that's not making sense anymore. So in light of your report, so I guess it's kind of like, how do you advise that, you know, gives that advice to kind of almost counsel a government?
So partly it's making sure that the advice that we give is not mischievously misrepresented, right? And that was this myth-busting thing, is you are still going to be able to get even LPG to fire your barbecue in 2035, right? But I expect by 2035 there will be a biogas technology which is widely available to power your barbecue, and that will contribute to a 30-year cycle of carbon sequestration and use, right? So instead of letting the narrative run away with they won't let me use my gas barbecue, we should say that's not what the advice was. And by the way, why wouldn't you want that technology if it was available? What we do say is we've got to stop putting capital, which is scarce in New Zealand, into infrastructure that is either going to be used to justify emissions in the future, like gas pipes to new subdivisions. We've got to say that capital should not be invested in that way, because the minute you put that pipe in with a 50-year life, you will have all the people who buy the appliances and plug them in advocating that they should be allowed to continue to draw gas. And we are saying the pipes that are in are still going to have gas flowing through them. The largest source of the reduction in petajoules of gas is because we assume Methanex goes away in 2030. And we assume that because largely Methanex have said they will.
Perfect. And last question, Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that analogy to the war, because I think that's a very good one, because if you actually look at the Second World War, New Zealand, for a little country, had a disproportionately meaningful impact in important aspects of that war. If we take the air crews, for instance, when New Zealand had a disproportionately high number of individuals who made up the key positions in those air crews, and that air war was very significant in the outcome of the war. So I see the same comparative in the whole climate change issue. And I just wonder, my question is, given that in many respects we have a receptive population, our response to COVID-19 has shown that, if we compare that on a world level. In Auckland Council as a whole, we ask our people to make voluntary water savings. We've been incredibly successful in that when people cast various aspersions on whether there'll be a response to that. How effective then, given that you've told us, and I agree, Auckland matters a lot and things like transport matter a lot in Auckland, how effective, sitting on the outside, do you think we've been in that very important communication with our own people to start change in behaviours now, given that you mentioned that the big technological changes will be in the second half of the century, given that a lot of things could, relatively low cost or no cost things to people, could be happening today. How effective do you think we and the government, but let's stick with Auckland Council, have been in communicating those small but significant behavioural changes people could be making very now, receptive people could be making right at this instant?
Well, I think it's going to help if we're all on the same page. If you think about the COVID response, part of the diagnosis has yet to come about why it happened, how it happened, and why we were as compliant as it appears we were. But one thing is clear, is there was pretty clear communication about what the expectation was, and an explanation by those who were seen as independent, and a recognition that we weren't going to get it all right all the time, but that wasn't a good reason for not trying to do the best we could. So I think there are always going to be parts of any population that are unable to be persuaded. And to some extent, we have to live with that and not allow that narrative to dominate the will and mind of the 2/3 that really matter. So I think I'm not going to sit in judgment on what you guys have done to date. Should New Zealand have done more sooner? Yeah, it would have been a heck of a lot easier if we'd started this gig 30 years ago. Imagine the assets that we would have spent our money on, that we would now be pleased we had spent our money on. Imagine if we kicked this can down the road for another decade and the regret that we could face then.
I might just add to that. We've been having discussions with groups on how do you get behaviour change. And one of the themes that comes out quite strongly is about it's more than communicating to people that they need to change. It's actually about enabling that change and removing the barriers and understanding. This is where some of that localised attention is needed, understanding what's going on in the local community that means that people find it difficult to make the change or haven't got options to make the change. So it needs to be thought about in a much bigger context.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Thank you very much, members of the committee. I thought that was a really fantastic discussion, really good questions, and honestly, it's fantastic to have all three of you here quite accidentally on this day, but it's been very, very valuable and gives us a lot of food for thought. I will just, and I had other questions, but I won't ask them, but my one question that I probably should ask is around what is I'm going to say what kind of feedback do you want, but what feedback do you want from us? What is going to stand out? What do you need from us? We could write pages and pages. We could send you Te Tarakia Tawhiri, our climate plan, and you would then say thanks, another couple hundred pages of writing. What is going to be the most effective feedback from us, especially when you say Auckland matters a lot and we can't do this without Auckland? So we want to do our best in partnership with you.
There are some specific recommendations about the relationship between central and local government. So I would task you to go and actually focus on, are they specific enough? Are they actionable? Are they measurable so that we would be able to pass judgment in 2 or 3 years' time as to whether a government that had said they were going to work with alongside and enable local government to play its part, how would we know that we could say they had or they hadn't achieved that? So focus on those because those are directed at the kind of decision rights and responsibilities that local government has in this. So please focus on them because that's where your expertise is. You also, because of transport, must look at the transport recommendations and say, are they reducing barriers? Are they creating enabling instruments? What kind of change might we reasonably expect in this context? Because if we go to Wellington and they say they've got an assumption of a 40% mode shift, that may be true, it may not be true, but it is unique to the setting of Wellington. And the same way if we go out to the West Coast and we ask how many people who currently drive are going to jump on a bus, the answer is going to be very, very different. So context matters for mobility because mobility is inherently local. We have a very small mode shift for kilometre tonnes of freight, like 4% over the next 15 years. So we're not doubling down on all the trucks going to rail. But transport matters for Auckland and local government is your thing. So those would be the areas I'd say please, double down on.
Am I allowed to leave one thing with you? We actually don't have public buses on the West Coast. You're lucky to find a taxi. But just when iwi do their planning, they're thinking 50 years out, 100 years out. The Ngaitahu Whakatauki mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri aki nei is that all of our decisions at a governance level are with us in mind today, with our children in mind, but for our children yet to come. So whatever we do, the decisions we take today, what impact is that going to come, or what impact will that have on the children that are yet to come? And our focus and our decision making is made through that lens. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. It was a perfect mihi to end on, so thank you very much. Because it's not a normal situation to have you here, we won't officially approve thanks until the end of the item, but I just maybe a quick round of applause for all the work and for coming here today. So and we will, members of the committee will take 5-ish minutes to take a toilet break or a drink break or just to say thank you in person to the Climate Change Commission. So thank you again.